You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 29th of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, we'll get the latest from Rafah, where the US denies a full-scale invasion is underway, even as Israeli tanks appear to enter the heart of the city. Then we'll hear about the closing arguments in Donald Trump's trial in New York and whether a jury might convict, before we head to Georgia.
We know that this is a very difficult battle, but the stakes are very high. Also for the West. I don't think that in the current geopolitical climate, our Western friends can afford to lose Georgia.
This from an opposition MP we'll speak to after Georgia's parliament passed a controversial foreign influence law yesterday ahead of elections scheduled for October. Finally, to France.
The far right is on the rise across all of Europe, from the AFD in Germany to Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, which is now in government in the Netherlands. Most of these fringe parties got their start inside the European Parliament, which is why these elections matter so much.
Monocle's Nina dos Santos was in Macron's hometown to report on the mood ahead of next week's European Parliament elections. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. We begin the show once again with the southern Gazan city of Rafah, where there are reports of fresh strikes as Israeli tanks and troops enter the heart of the city. For the civilians that had once been promised Rafah was a safe zone left in Gaza, the question of just how much worse things can get, whether a full-scale invasion is underway, whether they can stay or go to other parts of the territory, is all becoming more urgent by the hour. Joining me for more is Monocle's Middle East correspondent, Layla Malana Allen. Layla, thanks very much for coming on the show. What is the latest on the strikes from this morning that you can tell us?
Hi, Chris. So yes, overnight we saw more strikes again around the Rafah area. Just outside the city, it looks like these strikes have killed at least 37 Palestinians there and counting, injured about 60 in another one of these camps, one quite near the Kuwait Peace Camp 1, which is where the big strike a couple of days ago happened that's created so much horror around the world. So they are continuing to hit this area. The other thing that not many people are speaking about, because it's so difficult to see, but which is very important, is in northern Gaza, there is still a complete domination of the army there, and people are saying that there's only one working hospital, that strikes continue, that soldiers are roaming through the streets, that people are being shot as they try to find food. That's also happening around Rafah, where Palestinians on the ground are now saying that they are all sheltering inside whatever kind of shelter they have, because there are IDF soldiers out on the streets now targeting people.
Well, this goes, before we get to Rafah, just to follow up on that, this goes to the point, doesn't it, to a degree, that there isn't really a safe place for civilians right now, or what are the Israelis saying about where Gazan citizens should be going?
There absolutely is not a safe place. Aid agencies, the UN have been saying for months there is no safe place. The entirety of northern Gaza has collapsed, essentially. As I say, there's one working hospital there that's barely functioning. They have no food. Aid isn't really reaching. People up there are starving. Now, more than half of the population evacuated south towards Rafah, towards that border crossing with Egypt, where they've set up all these tents. And now, of course, we're seeing this Israeli offensive on Rafah itself. In the last few days since that began, last few weeks, since that assault began, around 900,000 of the 1.3 million people that had evacuated Rafah have moved a little bit further north towards central Gaza again, where similarly they have nothing. The Israelis are saying, and have been saying for a while, they want people to go to this strip of land called Al-Mawasi, which runs along the sea. That's about 1 kilometer wide. There is very little in the way of infrastructure in Al-Mawasi. It certainly cannot sustain hundreds of thousands of people. And all the people who have fled there are in these camps, one of which was hit the other day. There's a lot of confusion over where exactly the lines of this supposed safe zone are. There's been a lot of confusion on the part of the IDF as they make these statements. They're making statements every day, changing the borders of where this area is, depending on what they want to do with their assault. And the concept that desperate Palestinians who've been at this point displaced 8-9 times, many of them are injured, many of them are starving, would be able to keep up with and move at this kind of rate is for many people absolutely absurd.
And to that point then, when it comes to Rafah itself, which was once a safe zone as well, what do we know about Israeli troop and tank movements? How present are they at the moment right in the city centre?
Well, so of course we saw this strike on Sunday night, which caused mass outrage around the world. But since then, the Israelis have not backed down on their assault on Rafah at all. And they have now sent tanks into central Rafah. Yesterday, eyewitnesses on the ground were saying that they were seeing tanks at the Central El Ouda roundabout, which is a really central point in the city, also on the Zaroub Hill, which is just outside, which gives them a great vantage point over the whole city. And also now it looks like Israeli tanks have taken control of the Philadelphia corridor, which is a strip of land that connects Gaza with Egypt, and based on a peace deal, an agreement with Egypt that was made nearly 2 decades ago, that's supposed to be monitored just by Egyptians and the Palestinian Authority. Israelis officially are not allowed there. So it does look like they've got Rafah completely surrounded. And as I say, eyewitnesses on the ground saying that there are now snipers and tanks in the city targeting people.
Well, I did want to get to the sort of international, that regional reaction, Egypt, but also before that, the White House is claiming that it does not believe a full-scale invasion of Rafah is underway yet. I suppose the question then is, what is this if not a full-scale invasion? How much worse could this get?
Well, of course, the history of American action in the Middle East over at least the last decade has been a history of setting red lines and then those red lines blurring or evaporating. President Biden, who has become more severe on Netanyahu and his allies in the last couple of months, as it's become clear that they are not listening in any way in terms of humanitarian factors in this assault, has said 3 weeks ago that Rafah was an absolute red line for him, that he would not continue to send weapons that could be used in Rafah if they did launch a full-scale invasion. We're now seeing, again, a lot of prevaricating over that. Yesterday, White House spokesman for the National Security Council, John Kirby, said, "We are not yet seeing a full-scale invasion because we haven't seen huge troop deployment, despite the fact that there have been strikes on camps every night so far. And we are now seeing tank movement inside the city and snipers and checkpoints and tank movement around the city as well." A CBS reporter said yesterday in this briefing at the White House, he said, "How many charred bodies does the president have to see for that to invoke his red line?" And Kirby sort of very awkwardly said, "Oh, I take offense at that question." But they are still maintaining that for them, this is not a full-scale assault yet.
Well, and speaking then of red lines, there are also reports that this attack you mentioned on Sunday on a camp, that U.S. munitions may have been involved. What can you tell us about that?
They are. So CNN broke the story this morning. They've done an analysis of the weaponry that was used, and multiple weapons experts have concurred on this. Now, what Israel has been using a lot across Gaza are these 2,000-pound bombs, which are intended to bring down entire buildings. You know, these horrific scenes that you see of children where they look completely still, as though they're just sleeping, but they're dead. The reason for that is because the pressure of these bombs used on civilian buildings is so heavy that their internal organs are exploding. So they look completely unmarked. That is not what's been used in central Rafah over the last few days. What has been used, and this is what Israeli spokespeople are claiming, is that they're using the smallest munitions that their planes can fire, these 17-kilo precision weapons. The problem is that all weapons experts concur that using these kind of precision weapons in densely packed areas where there are camps and internally displaced people is inevitably going to have very high civilian casualty counts. So that's what the Israelis are saying. This evidence concurs with that what these weapons experts have seen is fragments and tail ends of these small diameter bombs that we know the Americans supply the Israelis with, specifically the GBU-39. Which we know they've been shipping over. And in fact, the serial numbers they've found on this casing concurs with a plant in California that makes them. So it seems extremely likely not only in general is the US supplying the weapons that are being used in Rafah, which Biden had said he was against, but in fact, exactly this strike from a couple of days ago was carried out using US supplied weaponry.
Just very quickly at the end, Leila, what have regional leaders been saying at all, particularly Egypt, when you talk about, that border area being taken over by Israeli troops?
So the other day, there was a clash between something people have been worried about for months. Egyptian border guards, obviously very tense, but also, very frustrated at what they see as, fellow Arabs across the border being murdered in front of them and them not being able to do anything to help. They are protecting this border. There's a border force spread out across it. And the other day, as Israeli troops moved along that line, there was a clash with troops and an Egyptian soldier was killed. So Egypt now on very, very high alert about this. Legally, Israeli troops are not allowed to be in this corridor. But then, of course, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, all issuing these edicts against Israelis saying you cannot be in Rafah, you cannot carry out this assault. And at the moment, Israel not listening to them. And while America, their main ally, of course, is increasing pressure, they're still not doing anything to actively stop them. So right now, it seems that the Israeli government and the IDF are just actively riding roughshod over kind of all international justice and agreements, which they believe they have to do to complete this assault. But whether international diplomacy will survive in the aftermath of that is the question.
Thanks very much, Leila. That was Leila Molana Allen. Now here's Laura Kramer with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. South Africans begin voting today in the most competitive election since the end of apartheid. Polling stations opened around 7 a.m. local time, with voters queuing at some locations, including in the vast township of Soweto near Johannesburg, where President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to vote later. Opinion polls suggest the African National Congress will lose its parliamentary majority after 30 years in government. South Korea and the United Arab Emirates have signed a trade pact today which sharply cuts import duties. At a summit in Seoul focused on energy and defense, South Korea was keen to tap the investment potential of the energy-rich Gulf state. In a statement, Yoon's office says the UAE reaffirmed last year's pledge of $30 billion in investment for South Korean businesses. And preliminary findings of an investigation into a Singapore Airlines flight hit by severe turbulence last week show a rapid change in gravitational forces and a 54-meter altitude drop caused injuries. A 73-year-old passenger died of a suspected heart attack, and dozens were injured after flight SQ321 flying from London to Singapore encountered what the airline described as sudden extreme turbulence while flying over Myanmar. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Laura. Now to New York, where closing arguments in Donald Trump's criminal trial lasted well into Tuesday evening. Now it'll be up to the jury to decide, potentially as early as this week, whether Trump is guilty of falsifying business records when allegedly paying off Stormy Daniels for an affair ahead of the 2016 presidential elections. Well, joining me for more on this is the New York-based attorney and author Jamie Floyd. Jamie, thanks so much for coming back on the show to review one last crazy day, I suppose, in this trial yesterday. And this case has been based so much around personalities, hasn't it? Donald Trump himself, of course, Michael Cohen, and all the other witnesses. But the prosecutor's argument in a nutshell yesterday was that there is a wealth of evidence here, regardless of those personalities.
That's right. That's right. Good morning to you. And it was a late night for the jury and everyone in the courtroom. It was unusual to go until 8 p.m. in a criminal trial, but Judge Merchan wanted to get the evidence in before the jury so the jury can start deliberating today. And as you say, Chris, the prosecution in its closing argument focused on what it said is its mountain of evidence. And I think that's a fair characterization. Joshua Steinglass made the closing argument, walking the jury through a comprehensive timeline of its case, starting with the August 2015 meeting when prosecutors say David Pecker, the then publisher of the National Enquirer, and Michael Cohen met with Donald Trump and conspired to suppress any negative news that would come out that might hurt his chances in the election. So, as we've said before, Trump is charged with 34 felonies of falsifying business records, and those falsifications were to cover up payments made to the porn star Stormy Daniels. But, Chris, let me say that the closing argument from the prosecution was loftier than just that, with Joshua Steinglass saying that he dubbed him a gloat, Gloat, greatest liar of all time, telling the jury the story of a candidate who conspired to lie to the American people during a presidential election at the time that mattered most, and that it may have shaped the outcome of American history.
Well, and Donald Trump himself, of course, was not the only one labeled as a liar yesterday. The defense, by contrast, focused on, for example, Michael Cohen, calling him the greatest liar of all time. I do wonder then, from your perspective, kind of which one of these typically impacts a jury more? Are they going to be paying attention to the witnesses who do have some questionable histories, or are they going to be looking, as the prosecution wants, on the evidence as a whole?
Well, right. Todd Blanche also used the gloat. You know, we like our little rap labels over here. So he also used the gloat about Michael Cohen, calling him the greatest liar of all time. And Michael Cohen is seemingly the linchpin of the defense case. The defense closing wasn't as tight. It was a rather scattershot closing argument. We would call it a flood the zone defense, a football reference. But it focused very heavily on Michael Cohen being a gloat, being a greatest liar of all time. Blanche's argument was shorter, 3 hours, arguing that he could not be believed, but also that they just say that the evidence is not there. And in our system over here, as you well know, the defense doesn't have a burden of proof. To answer your question, it's the prosecution's burden to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that each of these 34 counts Donald Trump is guilty of. To answer your question specifically, how important are the closings? It's not evidence. These arguments are not evidence. What, as you suggest, matters most are the witnesses that testified and the documents that the jury will take with it into the jury room later today.
And so if we do look at the jury now, I mean, there's two other aspects to this or related that I wanted to ask you about. And one is the legal argument here that the jury is going to be focusing on. But of course, this is also being tried in the public, if you will. The world is watching this as well. And so I guess in a way to both of those, one key question is, even if Donald Trump is found guilty, how severe is this? What is the likely sentence going to be?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So everyone watching this trial first asks, what will happen? Will he be convicted? Will he be acquitted? Will it be a hung jury where the jury simply cannot decide because any verdict has to be unanimous? Or could it be a mixed verdict where they find him guilty on some counts but not others, which is possible? And then the next question everyone asks is, well, what does it matter? Will it matter to Donald Trump's political aspirations? We're in the middle of a presidential election. Will it help him with his base if he's convicted? Because he can use it as a persecution point. Or will it help him if he's acquitted? And of course, if it's a hung jury, will prosecutors bring the case again before November? So I think he could play all of those to his advantage because, of course, this is Donald Trump. And many trial watchers have believed that he's been more focused on the court of public opinion than what's happening in the court of law. And that has really affected the ways in which his lawyers have been told to try this case, and not to the better, Chris.
And just finally, to sort of follow up on that, though, in the legal sense, what is your sense of what the actual sentence might be? There's been a sense that he might probably not even get jail time here. So what right. kind of is the likelihood, in your perspective, of what's going to happen from the jury here?
Right. So generally, these kinds of crimes are misdemeanors. They have come up with a rather interesting legal theory to make them felonies. So right there, the judge has some discretion, and normally a defendant would be looking at something like a 3 to 4 year sentence. But Donald Trump, interestingly, despite all of his time in and out of impeachment hearings and courtrooms, his criminal record is nothing, negligible. And that is something a judge would consider even if he were just an ordinary citizen. So, I never like to predict what judges are going to do. There has to be a sentencing report that's prepared by both sides for a judge to consider when sentencing comes around. Of course, that assumes a conviction. But I would say likely no time for Donald Trump, and certainly, Chris, no time before an election, because we have an extensive appeals process here in the United States that takes years to work itself out.
One more way that this trial is just going to continue going on and on. Jamie Floyd, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Yesterday in Tbilisi, what protesters had been fighting against for weeks became official. Georgia's parliament voted to overturn a veto by the country's president and pass a controversial foreign influence law restricting the rights of media and civil society groups that get foreign funding, also putting the country's path towards EU membership into question. Well, I'm joined now by Salome Samarashvili, Member of Parliament for the opposition Lilo for Georgia party and former ambassador of Georgia to the European Union. Salome, thanks very much for coming on the show. May I ask, first of all, how you voted yesterday?
Our party has declared a parliamentary boycott following the third and final vote on the bill when they adopted the bill, which basically is what we call here the Russian law, because it's a copy of the law which Putin adopted in Russia in 2012. We considered that it was useless to continue participation in the parliamentary process. And yesterday we didn't attend the session where the presidential veto was overcome by the ruling majority and the law was adopted. So we were not present at yesterday's session at all. But previously, of course, I have voted against the law on all three readings.
And what was the mood like then among opposition groups and parliamentarians like yourself? If you were not there, nevertheless, you knew this was happening, you knew this was going to go through, this was kind of that final step overcoming the veto. What was the mood like for you?
I was outside of the parliament with the demonstrators because thousands and thousands of Georgians came out again yesterday to the streets. Because people were very disappointed, obviously, yesterday when they realized that despite their protests, the government has decided to deliver on the Russian request to adopt this law and went against their will. So I think that for us, for me also as a politician, what was important was to stand with the people and to give them the hope that despite yesterday's decision of the government, our great battle for the future of Georgia is still ahead, because we have parliamentary elections in October when we have to put an end to the Russian proxy government of billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili in this country. And right now, what's most important for us is to mobilize Georgian voters for the upcoming elections, which will be a referendum about the future of Georgia, whether Georgia is moving towards Europe or whether Georgia is once again becoming basically an extension of the Russian state and Putinist regime.
When you speak of those elections in October, how does this law tie into those elections? I mean, how much do you expect to change in the 60 days when this law comes into force? And how much might that impact Georgia's democracy and those elections themselves?
I'm quite certain that the government will try to use this law against the NGOs which are doing election monitoring and try to squeeze them out from the process. But I think that we have to be smart, also not only NGOs, but international community. We need to find the ways to help the Georgian NGOs and Georgian civil society to survive in the next few months before the next parliamentary elections. So there needs to be an infrastructure For example, if the local NGOs are denied the right of monitoring because they are refusing to register under the agents law, the organizations such as, for example, OSCE and others doing monitoring need to find a framework which will extend international protection basically to the organizations doing monitoring. And we need also to continue very strong pressure on the current government, including introducing the sanctions, personalized sanctions against them in order to keep up the pressure. And we Georgians will continue demonstrating and organizing basically political activities to put pressure on the government before the elections. And I think with both domestic and international pressure, we can squeeze them towards the situation where Georgia avoids the dreadful fate of becoming another Belarus under Lukashenko, where elections are meaningless. And I know that we are now fighting for our last chance in the upcoming elections to achieve that.
Well, and heading into those elections, when you describe some of those measures that can be taken, I mean, what is the, I suppose, best case scenario for you here? Presumably it will not be possible to get Georgian Dream to change its mind on this law, but is there sort of a hope for you that whether it's with sanctions or protections for NGOs, as you say, the sort of response of the international community, do you believe that it is possible to have some influence over this current government, at least to ensure that these elections in October are relatively free and fair?
Yes, I believe that there is space to do so if we put the pressure, as I said, on the government, not under regular circumstances, but quite frankly, that's my personal opinion. Ivanishvili, on a number of occasions before, felt that he could defy the West and get away with that, and now he needs to be given a very clear signal that this is a different game. So I welcome the fact that in the US, both the House of Representatives and the Senate, the relevant bills have been initiated to support Georgia's democracy and put pressure on the government. I think this bill should be adopted. I think the European countries should consider adopting similar legislative framework. The EU needs to make very clear to the Georgian citizens that this current government is blocking their progress towards the EU membership, so that there is no geopolitical ambiguity, and the Georgians understand very well that they need to change this government in order to move forward with the EU integration, and the EU negotiations will not be open unless there are free and fair elections. And that said, I think that we can achieve maximum pressure. Following that, I think that opposition parties in this country, pro-European parties, have a very good chance to gather majority of the votes to build a coalition government against Ivanishvili. We are looking at at their experience of Polish elections, last elections, when there were several centers of gravity in the opposition, and they together defeated the ruling party. But that said, we know that this is a very difficult battle, but the stakes are very high also for the West, because I don't think that in the current geopolitical climate that our Western friends can afford to lose Georgia either. And it is very clear that for Putin, the stakes are high here, and he clearly wants to put Georgia firmly under his control. So I think for us, the Georgians, and for our international partners and strategic partners, the stakes are high enough for us to put maximum effort to change the government through these elections.
Salome Samanashvili, thank you very much for joining us. Finally, on today's briefing, to our continuing series on the European Parliament's elections being held next week. Today we head to France. Monocle's Nina dos Santos visited Amiens, the hometown of Emmanuel Macron, to find out what voters were thinking ahead of an election that could put the far-right National Rally Party over the top.
In Emmanuel Macron's hometown, the drumbeat of the European elections is growing louder as the big day draws near. Next week, around 400 million EU citizens will be casting their ballots across the bloc. And as one of the Union's founding and most powerful member states, there's a lot at stake, both in Paris and in Brussels. Trailing third in the polls, the vote could hobble the French president in the remaining years of his term. It could also cement the far-right National Rally's position as a serious contender for the Élysée Palace in 2027.
Le président est en train de nous vendre partout. Les Français à l'étranger, on a une mauvaise réputation.
63-year-old Françoise is a retired teacher. She says that she's fed up with hearing Macron focus on foreign policy instead of the plight of French men and women. And she says she might be tempted to vote for the right this time because at least they acknowledge the rising cost of living. But she's turned off by their divisive legacy of anti-immigrant rhetoric.
C'est bien d'aider tout le monde, mais qui s'occupe de nos vieux qui crèvent la faim.
It's for that reason that the National Rally is now under new management with a new name, in an effort to appear more mainstream. Gone are the fist-pumping speeches by its founder, the former French paratrooper Jean-Marie Le Pen.
Je n'ai comme seule motivation que servir les concitoyens qui m'ont confié leur confiance et leur quotidien. Élu au premier tour en 2014...
Instead, his daughter Marine has brought in new blood from outside the family in the form of 28-year-old Jordan Bardella, the party's new chairman, who tops the list for the National Rally in these EU elections.
Ça vous intéresse, ces élections européennes?
But will it make a difference?
Pas du tout.
Well, not to Ludo, who runs a hot dog van and is in his early 40s. He says he's not going to bother to vote next week at all. I don't care. Will they make much of a difference to me, he asks. I doubt it. And what if it were the presidential elections? Will he vote then? Well, yes, I'd care a bit more, he says, but I don't trust any of these politicians these days. They're so out of touch, he says. The far right is on the rise across all of Europe, from the AFD in Germany to Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, which is now in government in the Netherlands. Most of these fringe parties got their start inside the European Parliament, which is why these elections matter so much. France also has more skin in the game than other members, because the European Parliament itself sits partially in Strasbourg. Now into its third generation of leaders, the National Rally has assiduously rebranded itself as a more polished voice, campaigning for issues it says French people really care about, like more jobs, safer streets and more common sense. It now holds rallies in Bardella's native Paris, far from the gritty industrial heartlands of northern France where it first gained its support, and coincidentally where Macron himself hails from. But among these streets, there's concerns that the move is merely a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Macron. Macron, vous allez voter pour Macron.
Oui. Pourquoi? 62-year-old Mustafa was born in Algeria but came to Amiens as a child of immigrants. His parents were among the millions of migrant labourers who went to work on farms and in factories in the years thereafter. But he fears that racism could become entrenched in French society if Marine Le Pen and her entourage get anywhere near the presidency.
Moi, je viens pour la droite pour le président
Of course I'm voting, he says, and I'll vote for Macron. Someone has to stand up to the right and also stand up for what is right. Otherwise, for people like me, he says, France will become far less welcoming. Macron has spent much of this week on a state visit to Germany, on familiar political terrain again, if not on his own home soil, leveraging Berlin's shared concerns about the rise of the right to sell his message that more Europe, not less, will bring France a more prosperous and secure future. Whether that message gets through will have a profound impact not just in France, but also across the rest of the EU too.
Nina, thank you very much. And that's all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Paige Reynolds. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Tamsin Howard. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.